So I says to him, I says, definitely not on a Friday night, and certainly not with my wife. That'd be crazy. What?
Speaking of crazy, you're listening to the Dead Presidents Podcast, and this is the top 5 crazy succession scenarios that almost happened.
5, we're about to take a dive. 4, in the presidential law. 3, who will the top 5 be? 2, we're about to tell you. 1, let's go down the gun.
Welcome to the Dead Presidents Podcast. I am James J. Hamilton.
And I'm Stephen Lincoln Douglas.
As always, and we're here with another exciting top 5.
That's right. It's always fun to ponder the what-ifs of history, the coulda-beens. In some cases, maybe some people think, shoulda-beens.
Yeah?
There's been all sorts of, pretty wacky scenarios in history that are pretty fun to ponder. And we've decided to compile a list of some of these, presidentially related.
That's right. There have been 9 vice presidents that have succeeded to the presidency upon the death or resignation of the president. But what happens beyond that? There's the presidential line of succession.
That's right.
The Constitution states that, quote, Congress may by law provide for the case of removal, death, resignation, or inability both of the president and vice president, declaring what officer shall then act as president, and such officer shall act accordingly until the disability be removed or a president shall be elected.
That's right. While the nation has fortunately never been forced to avail itself of that contingency, it has come close numerous times. Prior to the ratification of the 25th Amendment in 1965, there was no way to fill a vacancy in the vice presidency. By that time, 6 vice presidents and 8 presidents had died in office, and the vice presidency had been vacant for periods totaling more than 37 years.
Wow. That's a lot of vulnerability in the presidential succession.
Seems so.
And there have been a few different lines of succession. Starting in 1792, the Presidential Succession Act of 1792 placed the President pro tempore of the Senate first in line after the Vice President, followed by the Speaker of the House. And it also provided for a special election to be held the next November to choose a new president.
Interesting stuff.
That's right. And then on November 25th, 1885, after the nation had spent nearly 4 years without a vice president, following President Garfield's assassination, the next vice president, Thomas Hendricks, died 6 months into Grover Cleveland's first term. Congress was out of session at the time, and both the offices of Senate President pro tempore and House Speaker were vacant, leaving no one in the line of succession for almost 2 weeks until Congress reconvened.
That's it, and this state of affairs is going to prompt Congress to enact the Presidential Succession Act of 1886, which removed the congressional leaders from the line of succession and replaced them with the cabinet secretaries in the order that their departments were created. After the Vice President, now came the Secretary of State, then the Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary of War, Attorney General, Postmaster General, Secretary of the Navy, and Secretary of the Interior. The 1886 Act also repealed the provision for a special election to choose a new president.
Well, then after Harry Truman succeeded the presidency, he asked Congress to restore the congressional leaders to the line of succession, believing that the succession should go to an elected official and that the president should not have the power to appoint his own successor. The Presidential Succession Act of 1947 placed the House Speaker first in line after the Vice President, followed by the Senate President pro tempore, then the Cabinet Secretaries, and that remains the state of affairs today.
That's just it. So some interesting changes going on in terms of the line of succession, and we're going to examine some really wild scenarios in this, the top 5 crazy succession scenarios that almost happened.
Number 5.
John Hay.
That's right. John Hay served as President Lincoln's personal secretary throughout the Civil War, went on to become a poet, novelist, and co-author of a 10-volume Lincoln biography. He then embarked on a diplomatic career, serving as Assistant Secretary of State and Ambassador to Britain before becoming Secretary of State under William McKinley and Theodore Roosevelt. In that office, he formulated the open door policy for China, successfully negotiated the treaties that gave the U.S. the right to construct the Panama Canal.
That's it, James, and no cabinet secretary has stood first in the line of succession for a longer period of time than John Hay. Under McKinley, he was first in line for a year and a half from Vice President Garrett Hobart's death until Vice President Roosevelt's inauguration. Then for another 3.5 years from McKinley's death until Vice President Charles Fairbanks' inauguration. On September 3rd, 1902, Hay very nearly became acting president when a carriage carrying President Roosevelt was struck by a trolley car. You may remember this story from episode 26. Roosevelt was thrown from the carriage and landed plumb on his face. He suffered a bruised face and an injured shin that eventually would require 2 surgeries. The carriage driver himself was crushed by the trolley and killed, a fate that easily could have befallen Roosevelt.
That's right. Hay estimated that Roosevelt had escaped death by a mere 2 inches, and that, quote, had the trolley car struck the rear hub instead of grazing it and crashing into the front wheel, the president would have been tossed to the left and under the car, just as the poor carriage driver was. The next day, Hay told an aide, quote, I had a hideous appreciation for a moment yesterday of how I should feel if the president should be taken away. I could not help asking myself if it is right for me to stay in a place with such possibilities.
Wow.
Prior to his surgery, Roosevelt told War Secretary Elihu Root, quote, if anything happens, I want you to be Secretary of State. He said if John Hay should be president, he would have nervous prostration within 6 weeks. In case Hay was unable to serve, Roosevelt wanted Elihu Root to be next in line.
Interesting stuff.
Pretty crazy.
Yeah.
President John Hay. He was around a lot of presidents who died. First Lincoln, then McKinley.
Yeah.
Almost Roosevelt.
Yeah, and the summation by Roosevelt, figuring that he would be prostrate with nervous anxiety.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting, because you think John Hay is a pretty great Secretary of State.
Yeah.
While he didn't make our top 5 best Secretaries of State, he was probably pretty close. He'd definitely be in a top 10. Someone you think would be pretty able as president.
Yeah.
Though maybe not constitutionally fit for it.
That's it. And, Lincoln was really fond of him. But then you have the nervous prostration comment. Kind of one of those things. It could be hit or miss.
Yeah.
With President John Hay.
Who knows what would have happened if Theodore Roosevelt died about a year into his presidency.
That's it. What a crazy situation.
The Panama Canal still hanging in the balance at that point.
That's it. Would John Hay have had the fortitude to see that through?
Who knows?
Speaking of who knows, we're going to move on with our top 5 crazy succession scenarios that almost happened.
Number 4.
Willie Pearson Mangum.
That's right. When William Henry Harrison died 31 days into his presidency and John Tyler became the first vice president to succeed to the highest office, the vice presidency, of course, lay vacant for almost 4 full years. And on February 28th, 1844, with 1 year remaining in his presidential term, President John Tyler attended a reception alongside many other dignitaries aboard the new USS Princeton warship, which our listeners will recall from episode 10, when it cruised the Potomac to show off its state-of-the-art weaponry. During a firing demonstration, the ship's largest cannon exploded, spraying hot metal shrapnel into the crowd. 6 people were instantly killed, including Secretary of State Abel Upshur and Navy Secretary Thomas Gilmer, while 20 others, including Senator Thomas Benton, were injured. Luckily, Tyler was below deck, enjoying lunch and refreshments at the time of the explosion. If he had been present and was blown to smithereens, Senate President pro tempore Willie Person Mangum would have become acting president.
That's it. There would be no need for a special election under the 1792 Succession Act because a regular election was already scheduled for that November. Mangum was a North Carolina Whig and a close ally of Henry Clay. Just like Tyler, he had been a Democrat until his opposition to President Andrew Jackson drove him into the Whig Party. But unlike Tyler, Mangum became a genuine Whig and fully embraced Clay's nationalist agenda. Tyler, of course, was expelled from the Whig Party early in his presidency after rebuffing Clay and vetoing attempts to enact major Whig policies. Contemporaries described Mangum as a commanding figure, an able statesman, and one of the ablest men ever to serve as president pro tempore. As president pro tempore, he liked to refer to himself as acting vice president, and Congress provided that he be paid at the vice president's salary rate. Isn't that something?
That's right. Tyler was threatened with impeachment at various times, and Democrats were said to fear the prospect of Mangum taking the reins. At the time of the Princeton explosion, Tyler's treaty to annex the Republic of Texas was pending before the Senate, and like Clay, Mangum opposed annexation. The Senate would reject that treaty, but after the pro-annexation Democrat James K. Polk defeated Clay in the November 1844 election, Tyler reintroduced the issue, and annexation was granted by the lame duck Congress just before Polk took office. Though if Mangum had become acting president, he likely would have withdrawn the annexation treaty and sought to retire the issue.
That's it. The 1844 election may have turned out differently, although it still may have become a referendum on annexation. Mangum underestimated the extent to which annexation would become the election's defining issue, and he also underestimated Polk, writing after his nomination, quote, "We will literally crush this ticket." But even if a pro-annexation candidate like Polk still won, he would have had to restart annexation from scratch upon taking office, rather than having it handed to him by the outgoing Tyler. Given how Texas annexation sparked the Mexican-American War, and how disputes over the status of slavery in the territory acquired from Mexico led to the Civil War, an acting President Mangum might have had a far-reaching effect on American history.
Wow.
Yeah.
Acting President Willie could have led to a President Henry Clay, even.
Indeed, he could have.
That was a really close election.
The thought of William Henry Harrison dying after a month in office, and then President Tyler being blown to bits by shrapnel from a faulty cannon in such short time. Good heavens, what a test to the United States that would have been, and indeed, what a test to Willie P. Mangum. But we're far from the end of these historical what-ifs as we progress further on the top 5 crazy succession scenarios that almost happened.
Number 3.
John Nance Garner.
This one's pretty interesting because prior to 1932, there was no constitutional contingency for the possibility of the president-elect dying before taking office.
That's it. Nothing. What do you do
Yeah.
if the president-elect is killed or dies?
Well, in 1932, they proposed the 20th Amendment. That is best known for shortening the presidential lame duck period by moving the inauguration from March 4th to January 20th, but it also provided, quote, if at the time fixed for the beginning of the term of the president-elect shall have died, the vice president-elect shall become president.
There you have it.
And the 20th Amendment became part of the Constitution on January 23rd, 1933, when it was ratified by 2/3 of the states.
A mere 3 weeks later, on February 15th, 1933, President-elect Franklin D. Roosevelt was in Miami giving an impromptu speech when Giuseppe Zangara, number 4 on our top 5 failed assassins, fired 5 shots in his direction, missing Roosevelt but hitting 5 other people, including Chicago Mayor Anton Chermak, who did not survive. Had Roosevelt been killed, the newly minted 20th Amendment would have led to Vice President-elect John Nance Garner being inaugurated as president on March 4th, 1933.
That would have been pretty crazy.
Indeed.
20th Amendment just in the nick of time.
That's it for Cactus Jack Garner.
That's right. He'd spent 30 years as a conservative Democrat representing Texas in the House of Representatives, the last 2 years of which he was Speaker of the House. He is maybe most famous for describing the vice presidency as being, quote, not worth a bucket of warm piss.
Yeah.
But he was pretty active as a vice president, attended cabinet meetings, credited with helping to shepherd many bills through Congress early in FDR's presidency. His relationship with FDR soured during his second term as he opposed some of the New Deal's more extravagant deficit spending and pro-labor policies, as well as FDR's 1937 court-packing plan. With FDR not declaring his intentions for a third term, Garner announced his candidacy for president in 1940, only to have FDR renominated on the first convention ballot with 1,093 votes against 61 for Garner.
That's just it. The Democrats here having no problem bucking the 2-term precedent in nominating FDR. Henry Wallace is going to replace Garner as vice presidential nominee. And on the morning of November 22nd, 1963, President Kennedy called Garner to wish him a happy 95th birthday, just several hours before JFK's assassination.
That's right, Garner adjacent to multiple assassination attempts.
That's it. And boy, that would have been something. FDR being shot and killed, and now, you know, because he's the one they're plugging.
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden, hey, John Nance Garner, you know, Cactus Jack.
Yeah, who knows what had happened then? Maybe we have no New Deal. Certainly not one that went to the extent that FDR's did.
Yeah, that's just it. It could have
wasn't-
meant some changes.
Yeah, Garner wasn't fully on board with all of that.
No, indeed not. Some interesting stuff that's just going to continue to get more interesting as we continue on our list of the top 5 crazy succession scenarios that almost happened.
Number 2.
Lafayette Foster.
Well, who the heck is Lafayette Foster?
Indeed.
He was a lawyer and a former Whig who joined the Republican Party in 1860. He represented Connecticut in the U.S. Senate from 1855 to 1867, and on March 7th, 1865, he was chosen as the Senate's president pro tempore. 5 weeks later, on the night that President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, John Wilkes Booth co-conspirator George Atzerodt was assigned to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson, but instead he got drunk and lost his nerve. Had Atzerodt followed through, Lafayette Foster would have become acting president. And strangely, under the Presidential Succession Act of 1792, a special election would take place in November 1865, and a new president, who probably would have been Ulysses S. Grant, would take office on March 4th, 1866.
That's it. Pretty unusual. But the most unusual feature of the special election provision of the 1792 Act is that the specially elected president does not merely serve out the remainder of the existing presidential term, but begins a brand new 4-year term.
That's so weird, because the entire presidential election cycle would be reset.
Completely and totally reset.
And then if the new presidential term happens to begin in an even-numbered year, as would have been the case here, the presidency would no longer be in sync with the two-year terms of the House of Representatives.
Right.
That would be a disastrous state of affairs. Would probably require its own constitutional amendment to remedy.
That's just it. Like, there's almost, like, it doesn't seem like there's any forethought here in regards to, like, what this could mean in terms of Congress. Really wild stuff.
And then what would that mean in April 1865? Because you'd potentially have Grant becoming president a year later, but then you got acting President Lafayette Foster,
right,
for that extremely critical year.
Yeah,
as the Civil War ends and post-war Reconstruction policy takes shape.
Yeah, it would be really something to ponder. Foster was a well-respected conservative Republican who supported Lincoln's Reconstruction plans and who would come to oppose Andrew Johnson's. A fellow senator recalled that Foster, quote, commanded the respect of the Senate in an eminent degree, both for his ability and his character. And he was held in high esteem by Mr. Lincoln, who often consulted him, and who had high confidence in the soundness of his judgment and the purity of his motives. So people thought highly of Lafayette Foster, who nobody has thought of, probably since he died, until we brought him up.
Yeah. Well, but he could have saved the Union.
He could have.
Because the period of time from when Johnson became president until December of that year, Congress was not in session, and Johnson used that time to implement his own Reconstruction plans.
That's just it.
Which were pretty pro-Southern, and that's what kind of gave the Southern states the green light to enact their black codes and to try to reintroduce slavery in all but name.
Leading into Jim Crow. Lafayette Foster could have taken a completely different approach.
Yeah, he could have got Reconstruction off on a better foot rather than the foot of Andrew Johnson.
That's just it.
Pretty wild.
Pretty interesting stuff to think about. And that is going to lead us on down in our top 5 crazy succession scenarios that almost happened.
Number 1.
John Marshall.
That's right, John Marshall, known as the Great Chief Justice. Lesser known for this incident.
That's it.
Because when the electoral votes were counted in the 1800 election, the incumbent Federalist President John Adams and his running mate Charles C. Pinckney were beaten by the Democratic-Republican ticket of Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. But before the 12th Amendment was ratified in 1804, the electors did not vote separately for president and vice president. Instead, they cast 2 votes, with the top vote getter becoming president and second place vice president. And while all Republicans understood that Jefferson was the presidential candidate and Burr his running mate, because the party had maintained perfect unity in voting for both of them, they were tied for first place with 73 electoral votes each.
Yeah, and what that means is that the tie has to be broken by the House of Representatives, the lame duck Federalist-controlled House of Representatives. Now, in that runoff, each state delegation voted as a unit, and a majority of 9 out of the 16 states was needed for victory. Federalists considered Jefferson a dangerous radical, and some believed that if they made Burr president, he would be beholden to the Federalist Party, which could then maintain its grip on federal power. Alexander Hamilton argued that Jefferson was the lesser of two evils and that Burr could not be trusted. Some Federalists wanted to withhold their assent to Jefferson until he gave certain assurances that he would not turn out all Federalist office holders, repudiate the national debt, or disband the Navy. The House met to decide the runoff on February 11, 1801, with the next president's inauguration scheduled for March 4th.
Well, they're coming down to the wire here.
Indeed.
On the first ballot, 8 states voted for Jefferson, 6 voted for Burr, with 2 not voting because their own delegations were divided, and that same deadlock would continue through 6 days and 34 more ballots.
Oof.
And there was another plan under consideration by Federalists, which was to maintain the deadlock through Election Day, at which time they argued that with the terms of President Adams and Vice President Jefferson expiring, both offices would be vacant and an acting president would take over, with a special election being scheduled for that November under the Presidential Succession Act of 1792. Now, under that law, the Senate President pro tempore was first in line, but that office was vacant in February 1801.
Uh-oh.
The House Speaker was second, but the office of House Speaker would become vacant on March 4th, at the same time as the presidency and vice presidency, when the 6th Congress would be dissolved in favor of the 7th Congress.
That's right. In January, an essay published in Federalist newspapers under the pseudonym Horatius had proposed that the lame duck Federalist Congress should pass a new succession act, arguing that the existing act was unconstitutional because the Senate President pro tem and House Speaker were not officers, as that word was used in the constitutional language authorizing Congress to decide which officers could serve as acting president. That same argument had been made by James Madison when the 1792 Act was first under consideration.
That's right. At that time, the Federalists had decided to place the congressional leaders rather than cabinet secretaries in the line of succession because of their aversion to then Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson.
Right.
But in early 1801, Secretary of State John Marshall was the rising star of the Federalist Party, the man most widely admired by both the Adams and Hamilton wings of the party, and the man that Federalists might most like to be their presidential candidate if a special election had to be called.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe Marshall would gain a leg up in that election if he could run as the incumbent acting president.
That's it. To complicate matters, on February 4th, Adams had appointed Marshall as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, yet asked him to remain in office as Secretary of State for the administration's last month. Some Federalists wanted to pass a new succession act putting either the Secretary of State or Chief Justice first in line. It didn't matter which, because John Marshall was both. The scenario under consideration would result in Marshall simultaneously holding the offices of Secretary of State, Chief Justice, and acting president.
Wow. Well, and to complicate matters even further, some historians have argued that the author of the Horatius essay proposing this scheme was none other than John Marshall himself.
Ooh.
What are Republicans going to do about this?
Well, they have to counter the scheme.
Yeah, that's right. And James Madison proposed that in the event of a House deadlock lasting beyond March 4th, the new Republican House should be called into special session upon a joint request by Jefferson and Burr, and then resolve the tie in Jefferson's favor. Republican House member Albert Gallatin believed that that course of action would be unconstitutional. He felt that Republicans might have to submit to a special election, though he argued that they should resist any attempt to install a Federalist acting president and leave the presidency totally vacant until a new president could be chosen.
Wow. That's pretty wild.
A lot of crazy...
Just have no president at all. But Jefferson is not going to sit back and let the Federalists hijack the government after the Republicans had just won a sweeping electoral victory. The Federalist scheme was based on a highly technical and legalistic reading of the Constitution, while Jefferson espoused an emerging view that the presidency was a popular office and rightly belonged to the party that won the most votes. Technicalities be damned. He was ready to advance this view by any means necessary. Pennsylvania Governor Thomas McKean and Virginia Governor James Monroe were both ardent Jefferson supporters and were prepared to call out their state militias and use force to oust the Federalists from power.
That's right.
So it's getting heated.
Yeah, and during the preceding years, President Adams had disbanded the large Federalist-controlled army led by General Alexander Hamilton, which left the new federal capital at Washington, D.C., unable to defend itself against the militias of the surrounding states. And with the House mired in deadlock, the Federalists gave up their plans to change the succession and resort to a special election. What happened? Well, in a February 15th letter to Virginia Governor James Monroe, Jefferson explained what prompted the Federalists to back down. Quote, "If they could have been permitted to pass a law for putting the government into the hands of an officer, they would certainly have prevented an election. But we thought it best to declare, openly and firmly, once and for all, that the day such an act passed, the Middle States would arm, and that no such usurpation, even for a single day, should be submitted to. This first shook them, and they were completely alarmed at the resource for which we declared, to wit, a convention to reorganize the government and to amend it. The very word convention gives them horror, as in the present democratical spirit of America, they fear they should lose some of their favorite morsels of the Constitution."
That's right, listeners. Thomas Jefferson openly threatened to overthrow the Federalist government by military force and call a new constitutional convention.
Wow.
Yeah. The crisis was averted on February 17th when Representative James Bayard, who as Delaware's only House member had complete control of his state's runoff vote, switched Delaware's vote from Burr to Jefferson, giving Jefferson the required majority and the presidency. While Jefferson forever denied that he had made any bargains, the Philadelphia and Wilmington customs houses would remain suspiciously in the hands of Bayard's Federalist friends. On March 4th, 1801, Jefferson was sworn in as president by Chief Justice and would-be president John Marshall.
Wow. A lot of different crazy things might have happened there.
Yeah, indeed, the most complicated of our top five, which is why it garnered the top spot. There was a lot going on here. And
yeah, and I'd never heard about this in this level of detail. Because, I mean, I've read lots of biographies of, Jefferson, Burr, Adams, and even Marshall, and they don't really, they just kind of mention this in,
almost in passing.
Yeah. They're talking about maybe that they'll make John Marshall president, that the militias might not stand for that, but I never really understood the details.
Yeah.
Because
pretty crazy.
Right. How would they make Marshall president? Because he's not in the line of succession. They were just thinking about straight up changing the line of succession. And Jefferson actually went to Adams to kind of see if he would agree to veto any attempt to do that. And Adams was basically like, why don't you just give the Federalists the insurances that they want and you'll be president tomorrow?
Yeah.
So he kind of didn't take a stand on that.
That's it.
But then I didn't really know about Jefferson, this letter that he wrote to Monroe where he talks about how his side kind of just laid out this threat and that backed them down.
That's it. Some Pretty wild stuff.
Yeah. Could have had a new constitutional convention.
Yeah. Can you imagine?
I mean, we talk about the revolution of 1800 now, but what could have been the revolution of 1801?
Right.
if James Bayard hadn't come to the rescue.
That's it. I mean, it's some pretty crazy stuff to think about and contemplate. There's a lot of fuel for alternate histories in this week's top 5. But we're far from finished because, boy, are there a lot of interesting scenarios that we could ponder here throughout our history.
This top 5 really more of a top 10 because we have several honorable mentions.
Indeed, we do.
Discuss.
Let's begin our honorable mentions with some Dick. Dick Cheney, that is.
Yeah, that's right. Normally, just a regular old vice president taking over upon the death of the president is not crazy enough for this episode, but we'll make an exception.
Indeed, we
for
will.
This one.
That's right. On January 13th, 2002, a day that will live in infamy, just 4 months after the September 11th attacks, George W. Bush was munching on pretzels while watching an NFL playoff game alone in the living quarters of the White House. A pretzel got caught in Bush's throat, and suddenly he was on the floor. His heart rate had dropped, causing him to faint. He blacked out for a few seconds, and when he fell, he hit his face and suffered ugly abrasions on his cheek, nose, and lip. Now, some conspiracy theorists suggested that the pretzel story was a cover-up, and that Bush had fallen off the sobriety wagon and was hitting the bottle once more. But one can scarcely imagine the conspiracy theories that would have abounded if Bush had actually choked to death on a pretzel and Vice President Dick Cheney had become the 44th President of the United States. Can you imagine, James?
No. In that highly charged post 9/11 atmosphere, who would have believed that a mere pretzel had been responsible? And how would a Dick Cheney presidency play out? Who would he choose as vice president? Would he have the political capital to get the authorization to invade Iraq?
For his pocket, he hopes so.
Would he run for president in 2004? And if so, could he win? Who else might have won the 2004 election? John Kerry, Howard Dean, Hillary Clinton, Al Gore, Colin Powell, John McCain, or perhaps, in Bobby Kennedy 1968 fashion, Jeb Bush.
Yeah, the sympathy vote.
Yeah. I don't know if the sympathy would be as strong after choking to death on a pretzel as in
seriously
the
doubt it.
JFK assassination.
No, I seriously doubt it. But wow, what a fluke instance that could have been if Bush had actually died and Dick Cheney became president. I think many, many eyebrows would be raised, perhaps permanently.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know about a President Cheney. He was ruthlessly effective as kind of a behind-the-scenes bureaucrat, not necessarily as the political face of an administration. So that wouldn't have necessarily been in his wheelhouse.
Right.
Maybe he wouldn't have been able to invade Iraq because that took a whole big campaign to get authorized.
Yeah. And he would have been sad because he wouldn't have made so much money.
No. He was divested from Halliburton at the time.
Yeah, well. Now that's going to bring us to a question, dear listeners. Benjamin Wade or Schuyler Colfax?
Well, that was a question on minds in 1868, particularly May 16th, 1868, when the Senate was set to vote on articles of impeachment against President Andrew Johnson. If Johnson were convicted and removed from office, Senate President pro tem Benjamin Wade of Ohio would have become acting president Some even argued that Wade should abstain from the impeachment vote because the prospect of his assuming the presidency gave him a conflict of interest, but the potential margin was too razor thin for anyone to abstain.
Wow.
Prior to the impeachment vote, many expectant Republicans were already lobbying for appointments in the Wade administration, and there were accusations that appointments were offered as inducements to vote Johnson out of office. However, not all Republicans were excited about the prospect of enacting President Wade.
That's just it. Wade was a very radical Republican who alienated many moderate Republicans with his support for high tariffs, soft money, and extremely harsh terms for the former Confederate South. Wade even supported women's suffrage!
This guy's insane.
Some Republicans feared that an acting President Wade might be able to use patronage powers to snatch the upcoming presidential nomination away from war hero Ulysses Grant. Some Republicans even suggested that Wade resign the office of President pro tempore, which would have left it vacant and placed House Speaker Schuyler Colfax of Indiana first in line to become acting president.
That's right. And Colfax, who would become vice president under Grant, he was a more moderate Republican, would have garnered a wider base of support as acting president. Some believed that the more amenable prospect of Colfax rather than Wade serving as acting president would have increased the chances of voting Johnson out of office.
Yeah, and that's kind of something.
As it turned out, Wade held on to the presidency pro tempore, and Johnson escaped removal by a single vote.
That's right, as our listeners know from episode 17. A single vote saves Andy Johnson. But what could have been?
Yeah, would have been less than a year left in the term here for either Wade or Colfax as they'd taken over. Wouldn't have necessarily been a lot of opportunities for them to change things, but it would have been the still unprecedented event of a president being removed from office.
Right.
I think that would have changed a lot of things going forward.
Yeah.
Even if Wade or Colfax didn't really do much as president in their time. Probably still would have had Ulysses Grant coming in strong the following year.
And it makes you wonder if, by default, like they would be like, well, should we nominate them for president? Because they were acting president? Or should we go with whoever?
I mean, in this case, Grant was like a pretty strong, obvious candidate.
In this case, there's no way it wouldn't have been Grant, but
you'd think a lot of the time being acting president would really give you the inside track to getting the nomination.
That's just it. As we proceed, increasingly wild and interesting stuff, which we're going to continue here as we look into another honorable mention, Charles Evans Hughes.
In November 1916, President Woodrow Wilson faced a close battle for re-election against his Republican challenger, former Supreme Court Justice and New York Governor Charles Evans Hughes. With the First World War raging in Europe and the U.S. under increasing pressure to intervene, Wilson worried about the 4-month lame duck period that the nation would endure if he lost the election. And supposedly inspired by Lincoln's private vow to cooperate with the incoming president-elect if he lost the 1864 election, Wilson devised a drastic transition plan that he set forth in a confidential letter to Secretary of State Robert Lansing 2 days before the election.
That's right. If Wilson were to lose the election, he would immediately ask Vice President Thomas Marshall and Secretary of State Lansing to resign, and then he would appoint Hughes as Secretary of State, and then Wilson himself would resign, enabling Hughes to become acting president. Wilson wrote, quote, "No such critical circumstances in regard to our foreign policy have ever before existed. It would be my duty to step aside so that there would be no doubt in any quarter how that policy was to be directed. I would have no right to risk the peace of the nation by remaining in office after I had lost my authority. Wow.
Well, that contingency plan became unnecessary after Wilson won a narrow election victory, but the 4 months that would have been his lame duck period were indeed very critical.
That's right.
In January 1917, Germany began sinking American merchant ships in an unrestricted submarine warfare campaign, and in February, the U.S. learned of the Zimmermann telegram, an intercepted secret message from Germany to Mexico, which proposed to return Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona to Mexico if it joined Germany in a victorious war against the United States. And then it would be on April 2nd that Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war.
That's it. Now, it looked, up until the end, like Hughes was going to win. I think California sealed the deal.
Yeah, then ended up tipping the balance unexpectedly to Wilson.
Yeah. And so how would Hughes have handled the Zimmermann telegram? War fever that's going on.
I think by those events there, the writing was pretty much on the wall, because Wilson, as much as anyone, wanted to stay out of war. And then at that point, there was just really nothing else to be done. But it would have been an awkward situation if a lame duck Wilson had been dealing with those things, with Hughes just waiting in the wings.
Well, yeah, and I think what's most remarkable in this instance is the fact that a Democratic president would have set up to install the Republican candidate that defeated him early.
Yeah.
You know, that almost makes Wilson look good. God, that's hard to say.
I mean, it's a pretty magnanimous thing, but then also there's also the common theme of presidents who leave office just being like, I can't wait to get out of here.
Right.
Like, the day that my successor takes over and I leaves is going to be the happiest day of my life. There's like several quotes of outgoing presidents who talk that way. Oh,
absolutely.
And I'm sure Wilson would have been eager to not have to deal with those problems.
That's
knowing that he was going to be leaving office anyway.
Yes, there are a lot of problems when it comes to being president, and perhaps it can behoove some to avoid them if they can. And that's going to bring us to yet another choice of an honorable mention. Elbridge Gerry and John Gaylord.
Well, this is another wild one. On August 24th, 1814... as the British Army marched toward Washington, D.C., President James Madison was on hand in nearby Bladensburg, Maryland, to review his own troops as commander-in-chief.
That's it.
And confer with his generals. But at the Battle of Bladensburg that afternoon, the poorly trained American militiamen broke and fled in what has been called, quote, the greatest disgrace ever dealt to American arms.
Ouch.
Upon learning that the American general had called a retreat, Madison fled on horseback to the White House and then escaped into Virginia before the British captured and burned Washington, D.C. that same night.
Yeah. Now,
a close call for the president.
Indeed. Now, had James Madison been captured by the British, Vice President Elbridge Gerry would have likely become acting president due to Madison's, quote, inability to discharge the powers and duties of his office. If Madison had been killed in action, Gerry would have become president outright. However, the 70-year-old Gerry was in very poor health and would die on November 23rd, 1814, less than 3 months after Washington's capture. In that case, Senate President pro tempore John Gaylord of South Carolina would have become acting president. Now, if Madison were captured, he could resume the presidency upon his release, but the U.S. would likely have had to secure his release by agreeing to less favorable peace terms. Wow. What a bind that would have been.
Yeah, because, by August 1814, U.S. peace commissioners were already in Europe and beginning the process of negotiating the Treaty of Ghent that would be finalized on December 24th, 1814. If Madison happened to have been killed, and then Gary died in office, and Galliard became acting president, they would have had to schedule a special election for November 1815, at which time James Monroe, who was Secretary of War and acting Secretary of State, and Virginia's favorite son, if Madison were no longer alive.
Yeah.
He's Virginia's second favorite son.
Right.
He would have been likely elected president a year earlier.
Yeah.
Another crazy scenario.
That's it. And that could have changed things for JQA, too.
Yeah.
Because he might have moved into it sooner and not had the beef with Andrew Jackson.
And, in this scenario, you might have no Andrew Jackson, honestly, because he got famous from fighting the Battle of New Orleans in early January 1815.
Yeah.
If Madison being killed or captured could have maybe sped up that peace process by a couple of weeks,
Yeah.
there's no Battle of New Orleans, and Andrew Jackson never becomes a national hero.
Wow. Isn't
Yeah.
that something?
Yeah, this one's pretty crazy because you could have someone assuming the presidency while the president is a prisoner of war.
Right.
Or you have the president dying in battle.
Yeah.
And then you have the potential of the vice president taking over and then dying 3 months later.
Yeah. Boy.
Madison didn't know how close of a call he had there.
Indeed. And that's going to bring us to our final honorable mention here. Another twofer. William Rufus King and David Rice Atchison.
Yep, we got another one where the vice president potentially could have taken over and then died almost immediately.
Right.
Of course, our listeners are very familiar now with January 6th, 1853, an event that has been commemorated on this podcast numerous times, far more than in any other place since 1853.
Indeed.
Franklin Pierce, 2 months shy of his inauguration, when on their way from Boston to New Hampshire, he and his family were involved in a horrific train accident. Their train car derailed and rolled down a 20-foot embankment, landing on its roof. Pierce was badly bruised, but he and his wife Jane survived. Of course, however, their 11-year-old son Benny was sitting alone in the seat behind them and died instantly when the back of his head was sheared off. What if Benny and Franklin had been switching their seats, and it was President-elect Pierce who was killed?
That's it. What if Benny had sat with his mother and Franklin was in the other seat, and President-elect Pierce had had his skull crushed in the train wreck? Now, prior to the 20th Amendment, there was no explicit constitutional provision for the death of the president-elect, but the most likely outcome would be that on Inauguration Day, the vice president-elect would be sworn in as vice president, and since the presidency would be vacant, he would immediately become president. In 1853, the vice president-elect was longtime Alabama Senator William Rufus King, the man best known for being the close friend and rumored lover of future President James Buchanan. However, King was suffering from tuberculosis, and by the time of his inauguration as vice president, his health was failing. He had actually traveled to Cuba in the hopes that its climate would benefit his health, and authorized by a special act of Congress, he takes the vice presidential oath of office on foreign soil. The only time that's ever happened.
That's right, and a little more than a month later, on April 18th, he died. Now, if Pierce had died in January, you got to think King would have undoubtedly have left Cuba and returned to the United States for the inauguration.
It's hard to say. His doctors may have said he can't go. He may have had, can you take the presidential oath of office on foreign soil? It could have come up. Because his doctors might have said, we can't move him. In any way, it's a lose-lose.
Well, because that's right. In either way, if he had become president, he inevitably would die soon thereafter. And then you'd have Senate President pro tempore David Rice Atchison of Missouri becoming acting president.
That's it.
Atchison was ardently pro-slavery. He would become a leader of the Border Ruffians, who engaged in violence against abolitionists during the Bleeding Kansas prelude to the Civil War, and then he would become a Confederate general.
That's right. Would have been kind of a shift.
Yeah, Atchison is maybe well known today most for the spurious claim that he was president for a day on March 4th, 1849, when Zachary Taylor's inauguration ceremony was held on March 5th, because the 4th was a Sunday. Atchison was Senate President pro tem then, and making the spurious claim that he was somehow president during that day.
Yeah, stuff and nonsense, because his term as president pro tem expired when the Senate adjourned sine die, and actually the only person that could have a claim in the ascendancy is James Buchanan, who was Secretary of State. So if anybody has the president for a day claim, it would be James Buchanan.
Well, Secretary of State wasn't in the line at that time.
That's just it.
Yeah.
So there you have it.
I don't know. In some of this, of researching all this, I've come across, there was a sense that because the House of Representatives has 2-year terms, the entire House always goes out of existence and then comes back into existence. But because senators have these staggered terms, there's the idea that the Senate is a permanent body that never goes out of existence.
Right.
So maybe that's where the idea that he would still remain in office as President pro tem comes from.
Well, I mean, he believed in it enough to put it on his own tombstone, although he didn't. I'm sure he didn't do that himself. It was people that did it. But
Yeah. Well, in any event, his better claim or better potentiality of becoming active president would have been in 1853.
That's right.
And that would have been a situation where there would have been a special election scheduled for November of 1853. And who might have won that?
Yeah.
Because, of course, in 1852, the Democrats had crushed the Whigs in a landslide after nominating Pierce as a compromise candidate.
Yeah.
But then you got, who were those other leading Democrats in 52?
You got a whole slew.
Yeah, Lewis Cass,
Stephen Douglas,
James Buchanan, William Marcy.
Yeah.
All could have become president.
Yeah. Very, very interesting to think about.
So many what ifs, so many near misses
That's it.
on this top 5.
One thing that's always a direct hit, the Dead Presidents podcast, which you have been listening to, and which is now, unfortunately, wrapping up. But don't you worry. Don't fret. We'll be back with more exciting and interesting top 5s in the very near future. For the Dead Presidents podcast, I'm Stephen Lincoln Douglas.
And I'm James J. Hamilton.
Go fuck yourself.